It's Sunday, June 22nd, 2025, and we have a double-barreled slight risk. One over here stretching from the western southern plains up into the northern plains, then another one out here in the northeast. And both of these risk areas have an associated marginal risk of severe weather surrounding them as well. In our plains risk sector, we see a elevated 5% slight risk of tornadoes up here in northern Minnesota. Then we see kind of a tongue of a 2% slight risk of tornadoes stretching down into central Nebraska. Then we also have a 15% slight risk of severe winds stretching all the way down into the western southern plains, all the way up into the northern plains, with an area of increased confidence in severe winds up here in northern Minnesota. And this is going to be accompanied by a 15% slight risk of severe winds out here in the northeast as well. But this is associated with morning activity that had already happened, so the risk here is pretty much over. And then last but not least, we have a slight 50% risk of hail up here in our central to northern plains risk area, with a increased confidence out here in northwestern Minnesota, and then just a general risk for hail extending all the way down into the western southern plains. And we also have a slight 15% chance of hail out here in the northeast, but like our wind risk, this was also associated with morning activity, so this risk is pretty much over. Here's our simulated reflectivity from the HRRR, and here in the morning hours, we can actually see some convection out here in our main risk area. This could actually sort of damper the environment out here today. But by mid-afternoon, we're expecting to see initiation of our main storms along this vorticity maximum and a cold front along the North Dakota-Minnesota border. And as these storms push through the northwestern corner of Minnesota, they will pose all threats of severe weather through the night and will eventually exit into Canada into the early night hours. Here's a view of our risk area from our central plains float, and we can see that it's kind of a similar story about initiation time around mid-afternoon. We see some storms out here in central Nebraska along a cold front, and these are going to trail just right up that cold front as we go further into the day. And then we also see some storms up here in our upper plains convergence zone associated with a second low that's expected to develop back here. And these are going to push into South Dakota and Nebraska as we go later into the day as well. Now, the risk down here with these storms is mostly going to be wind and hail, but I wouldn't rule out a tornado with either of these storm clusters. And another thing to note is that storms are expected to fire along that cold front all the way into the southern plains, bringing mostly wind and hail to these regions. Here are our 500 millibar winds, and as we can see, we have a large trough draped across the western United States, and that's going to be our main weather causer today, bringing that favorable southwesterly flow across our main risk area. And as we move forward into the day, we see a jet max sort of develop back here in Colorado into eastern Wyoming, and that's going to help force up our storms in this area in western Nebraska. And then we see a little prefrontal shortwave sticking out here, which is going to help to initiate our storms in central Nebraska and even up into our main risk area up here in eastern North Dakota and northwestern Minnesota. And then our 700 millibar winds are going to be most prevalent in that main risk area up here in eastern North Dakota into northwestern Minnesota. And that is one of the reasons why we're seeing that more elevated tornado threat there today. Here's a sounding from northwestern Minnesota, and as we can see, our photograph is going to be pretty favorable for all hazards of severe weather today. We have solid lower level shear and lower level helicity, as well as not a super large amount of deep layer shear, but definitely sufficient to help spin those storms. Our vertical shear today is going to be a little lackluster. We don't see much veering in our winds to help spin those updrafts, but there definitely is still a little. Our lowest cloud level is going to be low enough to support that tornado threat. We have a decent amount of cape up here near our freezing layer, and our mid-level lapse rates are going to be 9.1 Celsius decreasing per kilometer, so definitely enough to support that large hail threat up here in northwestern Minnesota. But the main crux for our storms today is going to be this more stable air up here from 1 kilometer to 3 kilometers and this warm nose at 3 kilometers or 700 millibars, which is indicative of a lot of capping or convective inhibition out here today. So storms could definitely struggle to initiate and stay organized in an environment like this. We also see quite a bit of dry air loft, which is mostly going to inhibit these storms today, but if they're able to get their act together, this could actually be an ingredient for increased strength of downdrafts or severe winds. We're going to have plenty of cape out here in this region, eclipsing 3,500, so definitely a juiced up atmosphere out here. Our precipitable water is going to be 1.87 inches, so possibly enough to help accelerate those downdrafts, and our downdraft cape is going to be nearing 1,600. So if these storms are able to get their act together, these could definitely pose a pretty formidable risk of severe winds. So in summary, this weather sounding is indicative of all hazards of severe weather being possible up here in northwestern Minnesota. And if we do see storms overcome that temperature inversion in their discrete stages, a strong tornado could definitely be possible out here. Here's a weather sounding from central Nebraska, and this sounding is definitely painting the picture of storms that might have trouble sustaining and getting organized. Our low-level helicity is going to be very low, our low-level shear is going to be very low, and our deep layer shear is probably not going to be sufficient for these storms to sustain. We see pretty much no veering in our winds, so our vertical shear isn't really going to be there at all. But if storms somehow do manage to organize in this environment, they have a fairly good primed environment for large hail and strong winds today. We can see that our LCLs are elevated, which is indicative of a more high wind threat. We have a lot of CAPE right here near our freezing level, and our mid-level lapse rates are going to be 9 Celsius decreasing per kilometer, so very indicative of a possibly large hail threat. Our low-level lapse rates are going to be very high, and our moisture is going to be sufficient to support both these risks. We also see some favorable mixing, so dry air loft right here, which could help to accelerate those downdrafts. But because our storms are having trouble sustaining out here, which is likely to happen, it could actually inhibit convection as well. But nonetheless, our air mass is very juiced up out here at around 4,500 CAPE, and our downdraft CAPE is also 1,600, so definitely enough to help support that severe wind threat. So sometimes anomalies can happen along fronts where there's enough CAPE, or a very juiced up atmosphere where storms sometimes defy all expectations and just find a way to organize themselves. But in summary, this sounding is mostly painting the picture of a large hail and wind threat if storms can get their act together in central Nebraska. Then here is a weather sounding from our western Nebraska risk area. And this is a very straight line photograph. So a lot of storm murders and storm splits out here today. Our low level shear is going to be quite low, as well as our low level helicity, but our deep layer shear is going to be off the charts at 73 knots. So despite all ingredients being kind of lackluster out here today, these storms could probably sustain and produce pretty strong rotating updrafts. And like I said, with our ingredients being kind of lackluster, we definitely have enough convective available potential energy for storms to fire out here, eclipsing that 1,000 threshold. But at the same time, it's not a super juiced up atmosphere either. We even see some capping or convective inhibition. So although the ingredients aren't expected to be super conducive for all hazards of severe weather today, our deep layer shear is just going to be so good that updrafts could probably sustain themselves for a while and even become strong. So the possibility of severe winds and hail is definitely in play for western Nebraska.